Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dave Deptula, Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, and welcome to the release of our newest report, a broader look at dynamic space operations imposing multidimensional dilemmas on adversaries. Now, everyone out there understands that space operations are deeply intertwined with all military operations. However, the legacy space architecture that we have was not built for the dynamic threat environment that we currently face today. Adversaries like China intend to exploit that. Efforts like shifting to a more proliferated architecture can increase mission resilience. The constant call from U.S. Space Command for dynamic space operations and the need to maneuver satellites without regret for the fuel used will add another dimension to the challenges we could impose on adversaries. However, there's a wider set of options that the United States can pursue to increase the adaptability of our space architecture. And this just isn't in orbit. Changes to ground operations, the link segments, and even launch operations can increase mission effectiveness and create operational dilemmas for our adversaries. Now, our latest report examines these wider applications of dynamic space operations and makes recommendations on how the United States can transform its space enterprise to create a set of challenges to deter adversaries from pursuing hostile courses of action. To discuss this work, we have the report author with us, Charles Galbreath, a senior fellow here at the Mitchell Institute Spacepower Advantage Center of Excellence. And we're also joined by retired Lieutenant General John Shaw, former Deputy Commander of U.S. Space Command and a strong advocate for dynamic space operations. And we're also thrilled to be joined by Mr. Trevor Hack, Director of Strategic Development for Space Systems and Technologies, General Atomics, Electromagnetic Systems. So, gentlemen, thanks very much for joining us today. We appreciate you taking the time to be here. Just as a short note to our audience, feel free to submit questions in the Q&A window anytime during the discussion, and we'll get to those at the back end of the program. So with that, let's roll into an overview of the paper. So over to you, Charles.
Great, sir. Thank you very much. If we can get the slides up. Very good. So let's dive into what will be a wave top of the report. We know that the reality that space is a warfighting domain means our space architecture must change. There have been very clear and compelling calls for change in recent years. Of course, one of the clearest came in 2017 from General Hyten. That call to stop building big, fat, juicy targets has put us on a path of proliferated low Earth orbit constellations, a path that we're still on, which adds a dimension of resiliency through numbers. More recently, U.S. Space Command has called for the ability to maneuver satellites without regret for the fuel used, for sustained space maneuver and dynamic space operations. But as General Whiting has pointed out, there's a lot to unpack with dynamic space operations, and I agree. That's really what this paper is about. It's unpacking what is meant by dynamic space operations in a broad sense, and what are the ramifications of its implementation. We know that the Space Force intends to release a 15-year objective force plan soon. Based on conversations I've had with Space Force leaders and recent public Space Force decisions, I believe this broader look at DSO is consistent with where the Space Force wants and needs to head. This is critical because we know that China in particular is increasing its threat posture with their ability to track and target all of our satellites, the increasing stockpile of space weapons to perform an attack, and the increasing use of their own space capabilities to extend their anti-access area denial reach. And finally, we've heard about the rapid progress they're making with dogfighting in space, performing orbital warfare maneuvers, and even refueling on-orbit assets to extend the operational utility of those systems. That threat, coupled with our existing architecture of static and vulnerable assets based on an assumption of a peaceful domain, creates a significant risk. This isn't just the orbital segment, but also the terrestrial link and even launch segment. Orbital segments are easily identified, tracked, and potentially targeted by adversaries. Our terrestrial systems have a limited connectivity and are also susceptible to attack. The link segment, which uses radio frequency channels that are known, can be jammed, spoofed, and intercepted. The launch operations, which are planned in months or even years in advance, limit our access to space and are susceptible to both attack and natural disasters. So what's required to transform? Dynamic space operations will increase the versatility, adaptability, and maneuverability of our entire architecture. What's needed to implement dynamic space operations is consistent funding growth from Congress that will accelerate the changes needed. Each day lost has a compounding impact on our relative advantage and vulnerability to China. Focusing first on increasing maneuver, which will make our satellites first harder to track and second able to avoid an attack that is executed. It's important to remember that over the past 3 decades, we have conducted a series of increasingly capable demonstrations of autonomy, rendezvous, proximity operations, and even refueling that have led the way to dynamic space operations. The fact that the Space Force is requiring the commercial GSAP replacement to be refuelable is a clear indication that that technology is mature and a capability the Space Force seeks to leverage. Another way to increase maneuver is through alternative forms of propulsion, such as nuclear, electric, and plasma. However, the combination of technical maturity, thrust, and change in velocity that can be achieved through these systems must match the operational requirements of DSO. For example, electric propulsion, which is in use today and is highly efficient. However, it lacks the thrust-to-weight ratio capable of significant maneuver to avoid a threat or prevent tracking. I think there's more work to be done when it comes to implementing alternative propulsion systems for DSO. As a result, we'll continue to leverage chemical propulsion for the foreseeable future, and additional research and development in alternative propulsion should continue. Other things that we can do to increase our on-orbit flexibility and adaptability are modularity, servicing, assembly, and manufacture, as well as software reprogrammability. All of these aspects can help not only upgrade or enhance the mission capability of a satellite, but also potentially change the missions those satellites do or add new mission capability to an existing system. We can also integrate elements of camouflage, concealment, and deception, such as decoys. These steps can add a layer of surprise, keeping potential adversaries off balance and uncertain about the capabilities, limitations, and intents of our on-orbit architecture. But as General Deptula alluded to, it's not just our on-orbit segment. The ground segment also holds potential for a broader application of DSO. There are several current Space Force initiatives currently underway, such as R2-C2 and SCAR, that are demonstrating new ways of performing command and control and assuring connectivity to our satellites. Coupled with existing approaches such as mobile ground stations that we've been using for years for nuclear command and control and missile warning, these approaches can open new doors for other missions to leverage mobile C2 and increase the flexibility of how Guardians operate satellites, thus increasing the resilience of our terrestrial segment. The link segment is also ripe for change. Frequency hopping is a well-established technique, and many systems do use it today, but it is something that we could potentially expand across the entire architecture. Next, as the Space Development Agency fields its transport layer, it will create an opportunity to have a path-agnostic connectivity to satellites. Moving away from a static point A to point B connection can leverage a multi-path approach that will be more assured. Further, the use of laser communications will enhance the capability of those links to add increased bandwidth and security of those signals. Laser communications are mature, and we've demonstrated them for over 15 years, from space to ground, space to space, and most recently, space to an aircraft. Implementing DSO to the link segment increases resilience, security, and mission effectiveness. The launch segment can also be more dynamic. Operations such as Victus Nox have proven that launch can be more rapid and dynamic than is traditionally the norm. We can take the next step by utilizing standardized satellite buses to create greater opportunities for flexibility in what gets launched, when, and from where. Of course, further launch site and launch vehicle diversity will also improve our resilience and our ability to flex to emerging threat situations and urgent operational needs. There are several factors that planners need to consider when looking at how to implement DSO. Not all missions need all aspects of dynamic space operations. While all missions can use some, such as frequency hopping, not all need to be refueled, for example, just like not all aircraft in the Air Force inventory are air-to-air refuelable. Offensive and defensive space control and ISR systems seem to be the most promising for the wider adoption of DSO. The orbital regime we're in also may dictate what aspects of DSO we could implement. For example, it may be worthwhile to refuel a high-value asset in low Earth orbit. However, the vast majority of satellites in LEO, particularly in a proliferated architecture, won't need refueling or mission augmentation. When you go further out from Earth and go to GEO, those options become increasingly attractive. And certainly we need to remember that dynamic space operations doesn't tie you to one orbital regime. You might be able to transition between LEO and GEO or even HEO, given enough delta V. And finally, the type of mission and the orbit you're in will dictate what approaches you can use to achieve DSO. Again, if we're focusing on maneuver, there's two different ways you can approach this. The first is to build satellites that are refuelable. The second is to build satellites that are cheap and then can be disposed of. But that approach is more appropriate for low Earth orbit constellations than it is for GEO. Further, each satellite that you build and dispose has a cost associated with it in terms of the payload, the fuel, the bus, solar panels, etc., and the impact on the available resources in the supply chain. But if you refuel a satellite, you're really only incurring the cost of putting that fuel in orbit. And so over time, the life cycle costs would actually be less for refueling architecture than for a replacement approach. Then there are more strategic decisions to make, not the least of which is who moves first. As a recent GAO report indicated, right now the government is waiting for a refueling industry to emerge commercially. Industry, on the other hand, is waiting for a clear signal from the government that this is an approach that they intend to pursue. And so a bold decision is needed now to actually state that this is the way we're going to move forward. And if we do head down the path of on-orbit logistics, there needs to be an organization within the Space Force that is focused on those activities. Right now, that's part of the launch enterprise, but what we're talking about for on-orbit logistic extends beyond that. It needs to consider not just the technologies and capabilities, but also the concepts of operation and tactics, techniques, and procedures to deliver on-orbit logistics in a combat environment, and how those forces would be presented to U.S. Space Command. Finally, we can't ignore the fact that everything we're talking about doing via autonomous means has already been demonstrated by NASA through crewed platforms. There may come a time when the Space Force says, I need a crewed capability to execute an emerging mission set. We should not prematurely rule out the potential benefits of crewed military operations in space and what steps we need to take today to enable those capabilities. Again, the Space Force's 15-year plan is the perfect opportunity to consider these possibilities. On to recommendations. I've talked about all of these elements, but the key takeaway here is DSO is not just about the orbital segment. There is a lot that can be done to change the orbital segment, but DSO applies across the entire space architecture. Many of these recommendations increase the scale of current efforts, such as R2-C2 and SCAR, or seek to operationalize systems that are currently focusing on testing, such as the X-37 or Rooster. Others are larger in scope, such as building an on-orbit logistics infrastructure for refueling and for enhancement and augmentation of missions via modular approaches. To make these recommendations a reality, there are a few overarching and enabling activities. First, Space Command needs to continue to broadcast a clear demand signal for dynamic space operations in all of its forms. Second, the Space Force should take these approaches and integrate them into their 15-year Objective Force plan and ensure a pathway exists to take DSO from planning to warfighting capability. Congress must enable these activities with consistent and reliable funding growth to support not just the development and fielding of new capabilities, but also the development of new technologies through continued Space Force investment in basic and applied research for areas such as propulsion. Finally, the Space Force should establish a program office focusing on in-space logistics and the operational changes it would enable. We know that space is a warfighting domain. We know that there are threats and risks to our existing space systems that need to be overcome. Dynamic space operations is a solid way to improve the resilience and the effectiveness of our architecture. DSO is applicable to the entire space enterprise and is a fundamental step in preserving our space superiority going forward. So with that, General Deptula, I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, well, Charles, thanks very much for that summary. Let's bring our guests into the discussion. And we'll start with John. John, you're credited with initiating the term dynamic space operations, and you've frequently talked on this subject and the need to have satellites with great maneuverability. What's your impression of this broader application of the term?
Well, thanks, General Deptula, and thanks for Charles. Thanks for your work on this. I think first of all, I'd just like to congratulate him for kind of taking some thinking to the next level, and I hope that his work will inspire even more thinking along these lines. So the term dynamic space operations is coming up on 3 years old now, and I think a couple things to point out is what the fundamental problem was that we were discussing at Space Command at that time. And the first was that we should contrast dynamic space operations with what I call positional space operations, which is basically, as Charles has talked about it in his briefing here, about we do things in a static way. We put satellites in energy static orbits. We move station to station from launch to orbit. We move station to station, point to point with our comms. Everything that Charles laid out, you can take that rubric and say, this is how we do things today. That's a fundamental idea, and it can be applied to everything Charles has said. The other even more fundamental idea behind DSO was that we aren't leveraging the principles of war and the ways that we do war in all the other domains in space. We're doing completely different. And how long can we sustain that in the face of an adversary that is going to normalize the domain across the principles of war and across the capability set that they can bring to bear, in a lot of ways describe what Charles did. So I say I love what he's done. I think he has taken a more focused idea that we had and expanded across architectures with those same principles applying. Let's go from positional and static to dynamic.
Very good. No, thanks very much for that. Now, Trevor, readers might be surprised to see a section on optical communications in a report about dynamic space operations. But I think the paper makes a compelling argument for the need to move past radio frequency architectures that are susceptible to jamming and intrusion. So where are we when it comes to operationalizing optical communications to, from, and in space?
Well, thanks, General Deptula. And again, thanks, Charles. Great paper, by the way. And from an optical comms perspective, I think collectively we're getting closer by the day, quite frankly. While optical comms in space is not novel, the widespread use of it by SpaceX Starlink constellation has definitely put it in the spotlight. And similarly, we're seeing the Space Force and the Space Development Agency specifically continue to build out the proliferated warfighter space architecture using a combination of RF and optical comms based upon the SDA optical comm standard. Associated with that initiative are efforts to demonstrate and build out optical comms links to other domains such as the ground and airborne assets, all of which General Atomics Electromagnetic Systems is deeply involved with. In fact, our efforts have recently been highlighted by our successful space-to-air low-latency information optical network, or STALLION demonstration of optical comms link from our SDA-compliant airborne terminal with an SDA-compliant space terminal aboard a Kepler low Earth orbiter LEO satellite. The STALLION demo was the first to demonstrate multiple terminal-to-terminal connections between two different manufacturers using the same SDA standard over a 3-minute continuous link. While the data rate demonstrated was only around 180 megabits per second due to the limits of the space terminal, the STALLION terminal, however, and the SDA standards support up to 2.5 gigabit per second data rates. We're currently in the planning phases for additional follow-on STALLION demonstrations with both Kepler satellites as well as the SDA Tranche 1 satellites. Additionally, we'll also be flying our own SDA-compliant space terminals by this time next year on our own half-ESPA space vehicles, as well as demonstrating connectivity to our own transportable optical ground station that can support data rates up to 100 gigabit per second. Similarly, the Space Force and the Space Systems Center continue to successfully execute the Enterprise Space Terminal optical comms program that supports the SIS-02 standard for higher data rates up to 55 gigabit per second and at 10,000 to 80,000 kilometer ranges, of which General Atomics is also one of the prime contractors successfully performing on. Which might beg the question, why the need for different standards? Well, I would offer the reason is similar to why we operate in different RF bands today. It depends on the mission and provides network diversity to mitigate operational outages, similar to what was publicized on Starlink back in July and most recently in September. There are missions where the warfighter simply cannot be out of ops, including command and control for more than 90 seconds, let alone 90 minutes. So kudos to the Space Force and the team for embarking upon it and continuing to build out and build on the technology that exists today and proliferating that across to enable missions going forward in the future.
Yeah, thanks for that, Trevor. The paper also talks about, and Charles mentioned this earlier, application of the principles of war. Charles, you focused on surprise and maneuver. could you share with us why these two stand out for you? And then from John and Trevor, what others do you think are also critical to apply here? So you go first, Charles.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So obviously maneuver, when you're talking about dynamic space operations and all of the work that has been done over the past 3 years to get that maneuver without regret as a term of art, that was an obvious choice. But when I looked at the adaptability that we could change the way we operate our systems and make them more flexible, I realized that we could create challenges and dilemmas for our adversaries. Right now, we're focused a lot on avoiding operational surprise, but what we can do with our adaptability and flexibility is induce operational surprise in the minds of our adversaries. And I think that's a key element. And of course, it's a time-proven technique that goes back to the earliest days of warfare. And so I was very interested in how those two aspects can work together to create surprise and potentially keep the adversary off balance so that we have seized the initiative and maintain it.
So
Others?
I'll pile on. I think so. Possible follow-on study would be. I think all the principles of war apply here, and I think you can make a case for all of them for DSO and why the approaches that Charles has discussed better enable those. I'll just give a couple examples so that Charles didn't talk about. I like his. One of the principles of war is offensive. It's pretty hard to impose dilemmas on an adversary from an offensive perspective when you're doing positional space operations, when you're doing static space operations. And I think you can run with that. You see where I'm going. It's hard to do that when you're sort of in a defensive crouch. You're going to need to do a lot of the things that Charles talked about if you want to enable the principle of war offensive. Here's another one, unity of command. So the Space Force, we talk in the culture of Space Force about mission command, right? Delegating as much authority down to the lowest levels as we can in order to operate flexibly. In fact, it's a great tradition across our armed services. It's not new to Space Force. But that's kind of hard to do and hard to empower our lower level commanders if they are constrained by the architectures that kind of freeze them in place. They're basically just operating statically, right? If they have the ability to operate dynamically, now you give much more authority and abilities to lower levels of command. So I could tick through almost all the principles of war here and say why we're not doing them optimally today in space and why we need to do so. And again, why we need to do it before our adversaries do it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, General Shaw, wholeheartedly. In fact, I was well prepared. I had a couple of myself just because I didn't want to get in a situation where in Family Feud I would have got buzzed out. You picked the two that I was going to look at, but from an offensive perspective, absolutely. Since we're talking about space as a warfighting domain, we need to be able to seize, retain, and exploit the initiative. Offensive operations are the means by which the Space Force needs to seize and hold the initiative while maintaining the freedom of action and achieving the decisive results. And it's fundamentally true across all levels of war, including the strategic and tactical intent, as well as denying our adversaries expansion of their A2AD strategies that Charles references as well. And quite frankly, I suspect that Space Command's top priority of integrated space fires gets at this principle, quite frankly. And the second one I'd like to highlight was different than yours is mass. I think synchronizing all the elements of combat power where they have the decisive effect, not necessarily concentration of forces, but the decisive effect on an enemy force in a short period of time to achieve mass. Mass the effects of overwhelming combat power and the decisive place and time. Massing effects rather than the concentration of forces can enable numerically inferior forces to achieve decisive results while limiting exposure to enemy fire. There are other effects that we can collectively leverage from other domains in our toolbox to obtain mass. And Charles, you touched on that as in your paper as well. And to paraphrase, what you've so astutely stated in the paper is the ultimate goal of the United States is having our adversaries make the decision that today is not the day to test us.
Well, Trevor, I think you know that you warm my heart in your use and application, and rightfully so, of the focus on effects, not just numbers. That's why Ukraine today, just to make a point, is not only holding off, but depleting Russia's ability to conduct and achieve their objectives, because they're fighting smart, not just with mass, but to achieve desired effect. Okay. So I'm glad folks have warmed up to that concept. Here's another question for all of you to consider. You know, it was 23 years between the time Major Spots flew the question mark demonstrating air-to-air refueling in 1929 to the time that we had an operational capability in 1952. So it takes time to mature technology. Where are we in the transition from technology demonstration to operational systems for some of these DSO approaches? And as an aside, Trevor, you discussed optical comm already, but are there other aspects that you'd like to highlight here?
Yeah, absolutely, General Datula. And in fact, since I spent a fair bit of time addressing the optical comms aspects, I'll be brief here so as to allow General Shaw and Charles to chime in and address the topic as well. Charles addressed one aspect briefly already in the paper pertaining to nuclear propulsion, but I would offer that nuclear power needs to be added to that discussion as well. One of General Atomics' founding technologies and capabilities is nuclear. We were involved with the SNAP 10A program back in the day and have continued to invest in and evolve our nuclear technology into providing mission-ready and mature capabilities for the space domain, including both electric and thermal propulsion as well as nuclear power. Additionally, General Atomics Electromagnetic Systems has a family of picosatellites that can support various aspects of dynamic space operations, some of which are already on orbit today, and additional ones being launched by this time next year. Lastly, and as we're all kind of tracking from a mission perspective, the EOI weather system will be launching next year, and those two systems will be in prime position to transition into operations and broader scale production. We'd be happy to tee up some of those conversations around these technologies and programs during the Spacepower conference in Orlando next month for those of you attending that. All that said, though, and at the end of the day, the Space Force needs to be resourced appropriately to transition these needed technologies from demonstrations into operations on mission-relevant timelines to add to their toolkit.
Yeah, well, that's a huge challenge, and I'm glad that you brought it up. But if we want to be serious about these kinds of capabilities in space, then the national security leadership, particularly our friends in Congress, need to fund them.
Absolutely. When I was on active duty, I had the privilege of transitioning a demonstration capability to an operational capability. And that was because there was residual fuel left and some capacity left in the mission set. And what I see the Space Force doing today is that more frequently. And that's important to transition those demonstration capabilities to operations. However, until we start making procurement decisions and actually delivering and fielding these capabilities at scale, we're still going to have just a onesie twosie. We need to deliver, if we want to deliver mass and effects, we've got to be able to develop capabilities at scale. And that just requires a decision. And as you pointed out, General Deptula, Congress to fund it.
John, anything to add?
I think I would just add, I think the technology levels are actually higher than our doctrine operational application capabilities. And that's usually not, it's often usually the opposite, but I think that's where we are. We demonstrated refueling with Orbital Express, well over 15 years ago now. The Chinese have clearly shown they can do it. We know how to do a lot of these kinds of things with operating the International Space Station and performing servicing and other kinds of activities. I think we need to, so I would say that actually technology is actually pretty advanced, and you have a lot of capital ready to produce that technology in an operational sense. We just have to match it with an operational architecture that's ready to take it on, just like Charles described with this game of chicken. We just got to kind of commit to it.
Okay. Charles, your paper identifies several areas where the Space Force is already moving forward with some of your recommendations. Could you walk us through some of these and why they're so critical?
Right. So, in the briefing, I talked about R2C2 and SCAR, which are space RCO activities to increase the flexibility of ground operations and increase the number of apertures that we can use to communicate with satellites. They've made the decision to focus on a few key mission areas with those capabilities. And that might be appropriate as an initial step, especially given fiscal constraints. But I think those are areas that we need to be expanding to a wider set. I didn't go into any great detail on the slides in the briefing, but Tetra 5 is going to demonstrate on-orbit refueling, and the program called GAS-T will also do that in 2027. So again, if there's residual capability that we can operationalize, that's great, but we need to take the next step and actually produce that at scale, because if your gas station runs out of fuel, you need to be able to replenish it. I'm also very excited about the RG-XX, the commercial GSAP replacement, and the fact that General Purdy has dictated that that will be a refuelable asset. That's an important step. I think an even grander step would be refuelable and modular, so that I can upgrade or enhance those capabilities going forward. So there's just a few of those programs that are already well underway within the Space Force. So I don't want it to come across as if I'm trying to poke them in the eye at all. I think there's great progress that's being made there, especially given the fiscal constraints. But my message to Congress is they need to be able to grow beyond where they are, because China's not slowing down, and we need these capabilities to defend our assets, ultimately to deter them from attacking us.
Amen. Okay, here's another one for all of you. In the air domain, it's no surprise that to succeed, operations require logistics in terms of a key element. But in space, one might say that logistics is still an emerging concept. So as decision makers weigh future operations and options, how do you recommend that we look at on-orbit logistics? And John, why don't we start with you?
Well, I like to say, I think, on-orbit logistics is inevitable, right? The further we go away from the bottom of the gravity well into the Earth-Moon system beyond, you're going to have layers of logistics to support whatever activity you're doing. A clear example that's emerging and will become more clear to us in the months ahead is the Artemis missions. You're not going to be able to have a sustained human presence on the moon without a logistics architecture that involves refueling and movement of supplies and capabilities across the Earth-Moon system. That is going to have a logistics architecture. It's going to be necessary. Why would we not be doing the same for our national security space capabilities? Of course we will. The further away we get from the gravity well, those things become inevitable. I think the most interesting question to ask, if we try to imagine what that logistics infrastructure looks like, is how will that change the design of our space platforms? Right? We wouldn't, right now, our space platforms are designed to launch and live their entire life alone and never alone, and never be visited and never be resupplied and never be, and their consumables never replaced, built with redundancies and a lot of things that maybe we wouldn't build in anymore if we had a logistics architecture to rely on. And that is not just for the national security sector. That could extend to the commercial and the civil sector. So that's the best idea I can leave the audience, is how would fundamental ways that we think about our space architectures and design of our space systems change if you had an on-orbit infrastructure? I'll leave it with a simple analogy. We would not be driving automobiles today, and they'd not be designed the way they are, if you didn't have a gas station every corner. But you do. And so they're designed that way. If they weren't, they would look a lot different, and they probably would not be performing as efficiently.
Yeah, it is a very good analogy. Trevor, thoughts?
Yeah, in my mind, there's a couple ways to look at, space logistics. I think most of us are familiar and already discussed with, as far as the idea of vehicles on orbit, service them from refueling or other services that Charles describes in the paper. And now, granted, it's been done, but it's still not easy, and I think you're still seeing some of the demonstrations and proof and concepts and I would say working out some of the concepts of employment and operations, I think, as General Shaw mentioned. And I think a second way to look at it that may be a little bit novel in its own right is to look at on-orbit logistics is by using space for terrestrial logistics. Programs like AFRL's rocket cargo are exploring those, or either parking assets in orbit for rapid return to Earth, or launching and landing logistics supplies almost anywhere within minutes to hours versus days to weeks with traditional transport services. And then lastly, and I think the primary launch providers would mention this point, and it might go counter to kind of some of the points that have been made thus far, is that given the ubiquity now of rapid launch, because we're going to be launching multiple times per day as a nation within the next few years, and the reduction in costs, there is strength in numbers. So many missions now that can be accomplished with larger numbers of satellites where their resiliency is available and don't rely on more complex on-orbit logistics, but rather the idea that they can reach end of life and be rapidly replaced. So we may want to consider reserving on-orbit logistics for where it's really needed and continue to improve our ability to launch and replenish on demand, which would then drive the greater focus, I'd say, on the launch infrastructure and the rapid access to space, quite frankly, and enabling those concepts.
So I'll just pile on first. I think it's a decision. On-orbit logistics is a decision that the Space Force must view as a requirement for future operations and not a nice to have. I also think that they need to look at it not just in terms of extending the life of an existing platform, but also fundamentally changing the way that that platform is operated and potentially adding new capabilities to it over time. General Shaw talked about the changes to the concepts of operation. That's going to absolutely be a fundamental transition if we have on-orbit logistics. And I talk in the paper that it's a hyperbole to say I'm building the aircraft as I'm flying. Well, in space, you could actually build the spacecraft as you're flying it in orbit, and you could add capabilities to it. You could upgrade or augment capabilities as technologies mature, and that can fundamentally change the way that we present forces and the way that we deliver effects from space. I think the flexibility that is enabled by that approach creates a whole new set of concepts of operation and tactics that we can impose challenges for our adversaries. And so I just think that this is a must-have going forward.
I've got one other thought to share on this topic. Because we don't have on-orbit logistics and we're kind of constrained by this positional mindset and the limited lifetimes of our platforms and such, we don't really allow our Guardians to really train as aggressively as they could with a lot of our platforms. And General Abdullah, you'd have great instincts on this, right? The equivalent of flying hours in the Space Force is very, very small. If you want to, however you want to translate that. And the reason for that is because we don't have the ability, because the lifetimes of our platforms are so precious, because they are positional and they don't have logistics to rely on. Imagine with RGXX when we have that. And by the way, I bet a lot of the folks in the audience don't know the new nomenclature the Space Force is using, so give me a second. The R stands for reconnaissance and the G stands for geosynchronous. And the XX means we haven't named it yet. So think of the old RF-4 if we didn't have a number yet, but we knew it wanted to be a reconnaissance and fighter aircraft. Just think of it along those lines. So that's what RG stands for, RGXX. When we get those, imagine that they're refuelable almost at will. Imagine now that we can do a lot of training and tactics development and doctrinal analysis, and Guardians can fly these things in a training mode, not strictly in an operational mode, because you free that up. That's another thing that's different in how we do things in space. That is not like how we do things in other domains.
That's a great point, John. Thanks for bringing it up. Now, before we shift over to our audience for their questions, let me offer one more for all of you with respect to next steps. The concepts and the approaches that we've discussed today all vary in readiness. Some could be implemented today, while others are going to take a bit longer. So what are the next steps to move us down the path to fully exploit dynamic space operations? So Charles, why don't you kick us off with that, and then Trevor and John can wrap it up.
Yes, sir. So the first step is to assess where we are with all of these technologies and what missions are most viable for implementation of DSO. And then second, it's to make that decision that this is where we're going to head. And then on-orbit logistics and the dynamic space operations that it enables are things that we want to be able to do. We've got to do this at scale. And then it's not just putting that in a 15-year plan and having that on a shelf. We have to develop the roadmaps to get those concepts and those technologies not just in demonstrations, but in procured and fielded systems.
Yeah, kind of piggyback on that a little bit. I think all of us are waiting, quite frankly, for that 15-year plan to be released, because I think first, we got to resource the Space Force and the intelligence community appropriately to operationalize their respective needs for dynamic space operations and on mission relevant timelines. And the Space Force and General Saltzman, tend to implement that 15-year plan to kind of put a stake in the ground as far as what's going to be needed going forward. And if my memory serves me correct, during a special session that he had at Aerospace and Cyber a month and a half ago, he mentioned the need and priority for integrated space fires, sustained space maneuver, enhanced battle space awareness for space operations, and active protection measures for space-based assets. It's really hard to argue against those, not only because he's the chief of space operations, but because they're also the top 4 of U.S. Space Command's priorities. The one additional pressing factor or need that needs to be considered, and General Shaw already beat me to the punch, but I'm going to foot stomp it anyway, is making sure the operators and warfighters have the training and tools they need to fly like they fight. If we're going to truly enable dynamic space operations, then our operators and warfighters need to be able to practice and hone their dogfighting skills as well. And secondly, from an acquisition perspective, we really need to be able to support getting capability and kit out of the demonstration and into the warfighter's hands. Let's get the needed capabilities on orbit and not change or add to the requirements midstream, which further delay their operationalization of those capabilities. And lastly, and pointing at myself as part of industry, we as industry need to uphold our end of the equation and deliver that capability and kit on cost and on schedule.
Yeah, I'm not much I can add. I will just point out I think the 3 large mammals in the room at the hardest bit. The first is enough of our resourcing being put towards space, right? Still nominally at about 3 to 4% of the Department of War budget. Is that sufficient? I think my answer is no. The second is even with resources, are we using them as efficiently as we possibly could? And I think there's general agreement our acquisition processes are not ideal. And so the answer to that question is probably a negative answer. And then the third thing is, are we really thinking about if we could solve those, right? Let's solve those resource issues. How are we now going to, from an operational ops concept perspective, how are we going to conduct space combat in the future? And how are we thinking about that, especially being informed by the rapidly developing threat we're seeing from China?
Well, thank you all for that excellent discussion. And as I mentioned, let's now turn to opening the session to questions from the audience. Those of you out in the audience know the drill by now. When I call on you, please unmute your mic and state your name and affiliation, then ask your question. Or we can, I've got a lot of questions already in the Q&A function. So let's start there with the first question from a good friend of Mitchell, Aidan Poling. And Aidan asks, what key industrial base and acquisition changes need to be made to support DSO? Should the Space Force look to develop satellites and components that are cheaper, but with diminished service life and capacity or capabilities similar to the development of less capable and cheaper engines and sensors for CCA and cruise missiles? Anybody?
I'll jump on that. Aidan, thanks for the question. And I hope you're doing well in your new role. Of course, Aidan was a research analyst here at Mitchell for a long time and a good friend. So great question. I don't think it's something that we need to dictate that the industry needs to build less capable or shorter lived hardware. I think as we build more, costs will come down. I honestly think the decision that the government can make in terms of saying we're going to do these things and we're going to procure at scale, that enables industry to open up their IRAD dollars to know exactly where they're heading. Right now, I think industry is a little hesitant because they haven't seen the full, diving into this area as a mission capability. And without clear signals from the government, industry is going to continue to kind of hedge their bets. And a a clear demand signal will drive us in a particular direction, I think. And Trevor, I'd love to get your perspectives on that from an industry perspective.
Yeah, we argue it from both sides. Yes, we would love to see those indicators and priority points, if you will. But I'll tell you right now, we are investing in our own IRAD in certain areas because we know that the bow wave's coming, the fight's on, and especially when it comes to dynamic space operations and space superiority. We need to enable our warfighters the kit to be able to go support the doctrine and the principles of warfare in the space domain, and we're heavily investing in those areas.
The only thing I would add is like what I said before. Imagine how things would be different across our architectures and our design if we had logistics, we had dynamic space operations, and we're facing a formidable adversary in the space domain. What changes? My guess is you'll have a mix of everything that was proposed in Aidan's question. There'll be some things that need to be cheap, the same way munitions need to be probably as inexpensive as they can be in other domains. But they're going to be platforms that you're not going to want to go cheap on. You're going to want some exquisite capability. And we have numerous examples of those over the last 100 years or so in our U.S. inventory of where going cheap was not the right thing to do. We wanted the best capability for our warfighters.
Very good. Well, we've got a couple of raised hands. Let's go with Isabel Porteous.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for this talk. This has been really interesting. I want to dig into that point that General Shaw made about cheap assets. I think one of the things that industry has been able to do well in the last, 5-10 years is show that attritable low-cost systems can get from demonstration to operational capability faster. And I feel like there is this inherent tension between some of those space mobility and logistics capabilities like servicing and building cheap things that you intend to throw away, right? Like I think of satellites as an extension of the consumer electronics industry, which is it's gotten cheaper. You don't service a phone when it's not working anymore. You throw it away. And I'm wondering where you draw the line in terms of kind of what assets are worth servicing, worth maintaining, and like how close are they to the warfighter and the warfighter kind of combat versus combat support services when you think about kind of the spectrum of what needs to be exquisite and what can be cheap and done quickly, if that makes sense. Thanks.
I think Isabel, by the way, Isabel, we know each other. It's good to connect with you. Great question. And I think you identified me first. So I'll go first. Hey, the wrong place to start is, hey, what's cheaper to make? Or what kind of capability can I get faster? The right place to start is what's my operational concept for doing space combat? And then how do I find that best mix of forces that gets me the best order of battle against a potential adversary? I'll give an example. And General Deptula, I'd love to get you to jump in on this. The capability to produce drones that can do amazing things that we've seen in the Ukraine war cheaply and mass produced is probably changing the way we think about air warfare. But I don't think anyone is suggesting that we abandon our more exquisite air power platforms and replace them all with drones. And so if you tease that, what's the right mix, I think is the right question, right? That you're going to need. I think they'll have the same thing in space. You won't do everything super cheap, but a lot of things we should do and proliferate it to achieve certain effects. But other things, we're going to want exquisite platforms. And I do think it's probably proportional to the further away from the bottom of the gravity well you're operating, probably your proportionality more exquisite and sustainable platforms you're probably going to have. General Deptula, can we put you on the spot a little bit when we talk about this idea of proliferation versus capable platforms and how you see it from an air perspective?
Yeah, well, no, thanks, John. First, I wholeheartedly agree. I have a couple of things that you've given me the opportunity, so I'll take it. The use of quadcopters with hand grenades is affecting land warfare much, much, much more than air warfare. What those really are, I know they're called drones. Drones is a horrible term because people apply it to devices that are as, microscopic all the way up to 90,000 pound ISR flying systems. When in fact, what's really made the difference is that these things that people call drones are really individually operated precision guided munitions. And the Ukrainians were forced to do that because they didn't have any other alternative. So they've been able to produce capability to provide PGMs to infantry personnel that has made an enormous difference in holding off an adversary that is multiple times larger than they are. But all that said, one of the reasons they're also developing long-range cruise missiles that people also mistakenly call drones, they're cruise missiles, is to be able to penetrate large distances and get to the heart of Russian critical centers of gravity that otherwise we'd be able to attack, as we proved so capable in doing so during Operation Desert Storm in many conflicts since then. The most recent one, the attacks against Iran, launched from the other side of the world with our B-2 and other forces. So it's those kinds of capabilities, and I hesitate to use the word exquisite just is the wrong word because it implies that it's something that's unnecessary. You use, I think, the proper term toward the end there, and that's advanced capabilities. Look what Israel was able to do in terms of achieving air superiority and crippling Iran with what? With F-35s that everyone's been beating up on because they provide the capability that's not available with any other system, which is a unique aspect that nations that bought that capability have that no one else does. You give me a wing of F-35s and F-22s and put them in play under trained pilots in Ukraine today, and Russia would be toast in less than a week. So they're my thoughts on the subject. So I hope that helped.
I think the takeaway for the audience is that, Isabel, your question applies to all the domains right now on how we're using advanced technologies in production and such. And so just to realize that, and that we shouldn't treat space as special in that regard.
Yeah, very good point. All right, let's go back to a raised hand here. Niall Sandel, go ahead.
Mute. Yes, thanks very much for this very informative presentation. My question concerns very intriguing things which you see in the open press about how space warfare is going to be like air-to-air warfare with fighters dogfighting and all the very similar complexities. And my question is, of course, when you're in space, you got a big velocity vector that you got to try and push around, which takes a lot of delta V. So where's this delta V going to come from? Are there things we can do today? Do we need breakthroughs in propulsion technology in order to achieve this vision? So any commentaries you gentlemen would have on this topic would be appreciated. Thank you.
Hey, I'll go first, Niels. I wouldn't over-prescribe how you see things intuitively in the air domain to how things work in space. The physics are different, but a lot of the same principles will apply. You're going to need to want to detect closed kill chains, detect threats, close kill chains faster than your adversary can, and achieve effects faster than they can. And so delta V is only going to be part of that solution.
I'll pile on and say that China and the United States, we're all going to be in the same laws of physics when it comes to orbital warfare. And what's being demonstrated now is maybe closer to dirigibles, trying to gain advantage over one another than F-35s or F-22s engaging in combat. However, the term, orbital dogfighting or space dogfighting, I think is useful because it enables people to think about it in an analogous way. And that is useful because so much of space is really hard for people to understand and comprehend. So I do think that there's some value in that term. Now, you asked about Delta V. There's different ways that you can approach that. I do think that many of our assets have Delta V, but we husband it so carefully because it is a precious resource. If we were able to refuel that and replenish it, I think we'd be using it a lot more frequently and conducting even larger maneuvers than we have to date. So I think that refueling aspect is going to be critical in future. Yes, there's room for continued improvements in propulsion technology. I will never doubt that until we can teleport people from point A to point B instantaneously. So
hey, let me double down on, sorry, Charles. I was going to say,
Yeah,
let me
go
double
ahead.
down on something in Charles' briefing that he kind of went past, but it was important, is he said he put thrust before Delta V. And remember what I said, we kind of design our satellites today because to operate efficiently and in static ways. So the amount of thrust available to them is usually designed to be very, very small. You don't need it. Why would you have a large thrust capability if you aren't ever going to use a lot of fuel all at once? So I would just say every time we say Delta V, we should probably throw thrust into that equation too. Delta V is the size of your gas tank. Thrust is the how big your engine is. And right now we got one piston engines out there with gas tanks that aren't that big and one piston engines and that's why what Charles said is accurate. It really looks like dirigibles fighting one another. They're moving slow compared to what is in the realm of the possible.
Great points. Let's move on to Courtney Albin. Courtney?
Yes, thank you. The report briefly discusses the possibility of having guardians in space in the future and how that could maybe enhance dynamic space operations, particularly when it comes to human decision making. I'm curious, General Shaw, kind of what's your take on that, and how should the Space Force factor in that possibility as it crafts this like future roadmap?
Yeah, hey, Courtney, well, hey, good to hear from you again. And thanks for being here today. Hey, I've actually on record saying I don't think we're going to be putting Guardians in space anytime soon. There's a lot of reasons for that, and not least of which is the growing ability to do things autonomously in a lot of ways that were described. However, it is inevitable. There will be Guardians in space one day. And I think it's just a matter of what does that time constant look like. And I think Charles was wise to point out in his brief that we should probably keep an eye on what that looks like and when, under what circumstances, we're going to need Guardians in the domain itself. It's probably when we're projecting power across great distances, and it's probably so they can be closer to an intense command and control capability where you need humans in the decision making. And so I would run with that. But I don't think Charles was also saying, hey, we're going to do this in the next 5 years. I don't think that's what the time horizon is, but it is inevitable.
I agree with you, General Shaw, that it is inevitable. And I think that the Space Force needs to be thinking about that inevitability and what steps it will take to get there. We can't wake up one day and say, my gosh, we need Guardians in space. Well, we needed to make that decision 10 years ago because it's going to take that long to develop the pipeline and the training and the capabilities in order to enable that. So I just think that we need to be mindful that that inevitability will one day come, understanding what those triggers will be to make it such, and then planning accordingly.
Okay, we're coming up on our time, but we've got one more great American who's a good friend and mentor, and I'm going to turn it over to him for the last question. John Borling, go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we got you.
Okay, super. The question seems to me also that we ought to be talking about is lethality, space to land, because if directed energy weapons or the like get up there on the high ground before we do, that's a serious consideration. And I don't hear a lot of discussion, perhaps because of classification, about that possibility. There were programs back years ago when I was in SAC with trying to do something with B-52s and directed energy stuff that got canceled, and haven't heard or even expressions of mindset, again, unless classification applies, about space to Earth application. Any comments on that?
I'll dive in on that. I think it's an area that we have to explore further, and it's an area that we plan to talk about in some of our upcoming space workshops. Certainly, the call for space-based interceptors to support missile defense opens up the possibility of additional space-to-ground or space-to-air effects that can be generated. Will those be stabilizing or destabilizing? What impact will that have on the structure of future forces in the other terrestrial domains? Those are all great questions that have to be explored. Certainly the flexibility that we're talking about through DSO on orbit could create some of those potentials as well. So I definitely think this is an area that merits a lot more discussion in the open, quite frankly. And as you pointed out, there probably were classified discussions years ago. But we need to have those debates and discussions out in the open to really advance the ball further forward.
I would just add, physics doesn't prevent any of that, and we should be on the lookout for an adversary that's developing those kinds of capabilities against us.
Okay, well, ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, we've come to the end of this rollout. General Shaw and Mr. Hack, thank you again for joining us today. Charles, my thanks to you for a really insightful report, which, by the way, is now available on our website at mitchellaerospacepower.org, or you can just Google Mitchell Institute. So please go check it out. And to our audience out there, from all of us at the Mitchell Institute, have a great space power kind of day.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.